Hello everyone, today we talk about the military history of Otto II, Holy Roman Emperor. For some reason, oddly enough, every time I make a video about the Ottonians, people do not react to it that much. Strange, because the topic is really that sort of majestic and prestigious as it can get. We also tend to, in fact, talk a bit too much about the bigger picture, what they achieved, but really when it gets to the actual story, the eventmental facts, it's all sort of who were these guys, and that's a strange attitude. Again, it happens online all the time. There is a characterization almost like in a cinematic fashion of the era of the emperor, but it's important to look at the actual reason why these were Holy Roman Emperors, and so how they wielded the Sacrum Imperium, that is the Holy Ghost, and therefore Roman victory. So Otto II, known as the Red, was born in 955 as the third son of Otto I, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Adelaide of Italy. We must start from this because this is not really going to be a general biography. It's just about the military side of his story, but it's important to realize what's Otto's personal background and what was happening as a whole while he was on campaign. Right? As a member of the Ottonian dynasty, he became the sole surviving son after the deaths of his brothers Henry in 952 and Bruno in 953. We are in 957, positioning Otto as Otto I's heir apparent by that point. It was dramatically common to witness a third of your siblings on their deathbed as children, as adolescent. It was something, however, deeply higher and more meaningful, because here we're talking about the golden offspring of the great imperium wielder, the author of probably the Renovatio Imperii, of the tying of the Eastern Frankish and the Italic kingdom. Once again, after a long time, this disconnection of Transalpine power from Rome for a few generations. Not that context had not existed, but in a sense, these rulers now were called to wage a level of power that was really unprecedented since Carolingian times. Just yesterday we were observing how the different areas in western and eastern Francia that reactivated at different times as the major powers in Europe after the fall of the Carolingian Empire were not really at some point switched off, right? And the reasons why, for example, the Ottonian Empire could happen, or as we were looking at yesterday, the First Crusade, essentially mostly from a French and Siculo-Norman power basis, could be launched to the to the conquest of the Mediterranean, to the reunion of the former Roman Empire, was something that was really more tied to will to power than any specific material availability. It had basically always been there. Obviously, the more, widespread the empire, the easier it is for these sovereigns to be recognized as emperors, paradoxically, because they will not pressure too much the local communities by having a fundamentally itinerant, and in fact quite sort of military-oriented, which, yes, is costly, etc., but still, because it happened, being backed by the local communities. We, for example, observed in part Otto's exploit in the video about the German-Polish wars between the 10th and the 12th century. We have to appreciate the very sound moral and material expansion, or a re-expansion of the West at this point in history, especially needed after the period of so-called second invasions that had temporarily paralyzed, at least sort of engulfed, most of the local political and institutional, at least accomplishment at a royal and imperial level. So Otto's survival, also as his father's namesake, was intended in a very great providential way. Eventually, Otto I, Otto III will become the more famous of the Ottonians. But Otto II was also particularly important. And the military side, this continuous and a very Frankish way to war, fundamentally, this continuous military expeditions, campaigning, necessity to tame different populations at the frontiers, but also coping with internal strife, is a defining characteristic of these high medieval rulers and of properly the universal authority par excellence that the emperor is. Let's stress, as we know, that Otto had also Byzantine wife. There was a big deal of Byzantine influence. I also made an entire video explaining this in the development of Germanic imperial ideology, especially at this point in history. It's not like this idea that fundamentally the imperator was still superior, above the clergy, the traditional doctrine of the cases, was alien to the Germans. But naturally there was a great emphasis placed on that, given the model that the Byzantines in Constantinople had with the local church, a very powerful one in its own regard, but was sort of subjugated to the emperor. Something that essentially in the West will fail, not because of a dysfunctionality, but actually because of the greater civilizational force agitating within the system, as opposed to a more sclerotic Byzantine reality that did not create any of the civilizational output, starting especially from the 11th century, juridically, scientifically, institutionally, politically, that stemmed from the investiture controversy. And this massive tandem was not an antagonism only, actually was a great level of cooperation, paradoxically, also in struggling for the exact definition of the imperial, imperial and the papal, the universal authorities' prerogatives. All right. Now, Otto's father ensured his education was comprehensive, entrusting his literary and cultural training to his illegitimate son, the Archbishop William of Mainz, one of, as you know, the most important ecclesiastical principalities in Germany, while Margrave Otto instructed Otto in warfare and legal customs. This is a very beautiful concept. Otto I was a bit of at the time, like, these guys were not really very educated, but he was fairly ignorant, let's say, by what our ignorance standards would be. Naturally, you're not more intelligent or capable than Otto I, but he was not a man of letters for sure. Other siblings destined to the church, in this case also the legitimate son, were, as a matter of fact, they were really great intellectual figures, profiling in Ottonian Germany at this point, and across the empire. But Otto I has this farsightedness in conferring his son a proper education, proper literary and cultural education, which was in fact fairly uncommon, at least in that circumstance. Naturally, military training is not even to be discussed. It's going to be there. It's going to be as absolute and brutal and obvious in this courtly and de facto already proto-feudal and chivalric reality. That thing had always existed to begin with. To secure dynastic continuity, Otto I had also Otto II elected co-regent at age 6 during a diet at Worms in May 961, followed by his coronation by Archbishop Bruno of Cologne at Aachen Cathedral, likely on Pentecost, that is, on that year, May the 26th. This act violated Saxon tradition, however, which required heirs to reach majority before such appointments, likely motivated by the risks of Otto I's Italian campaign to claim the imperial title. This can be explained naturally in many ways. There was, as always, a sense, as we said before, that the current ruler had to be a fully grown man that had proven himself as a warrior, with literally earning his father's appreciation and equation. There's a very interesting Germanic tradition in all of this, where if you hadn't gone out there and distinguished yourself as a king yourself, you couldn't sit at your king father's table, right? And so obviously the Saxons, as you know, were an incredibly brutal and bloodthirsty people. They were, at this point, one of the single most important, famous, and interesting peoples out there. They are the guys who carried out the Renovatio Imperii, the staunchest opponents of Charlemagne that ended up inheriting the Holy Roman Empire. This came, as we were just explaining, with an important set of sort of change of mindset and practice. The practical reason for this Saxon discontent was mostly the fact that, of course, like a minor in charge, or properly the bestowal of this imperial, de facto imperial power, because when we're talking about regnum or imperium, basically we're looking at the same thing. If anything, I'm going to make a theological history video about this. And so this seemed like, this guy is just appointing his son as a child. So it's not just that we are doing this on parole, basically, but we are witnessing to a guy who is trivializing the Cingulum Militaris, the imperial tradition, and basically put his dynasty at the center in an exclusivistic fashion, not adequately considering the rest of the Saxon nobility. Of course, there was also a necessity of dynastic continuity understood by the Saxon establishment. However, there were also other branches of the Ottonians, for that matter, that later, as you know, the Bavarian one will take over with Henry II at the death of Otto III. I also made a video about Widukind of Corvey, Liutprand of Cremona. These are the major sort of ideologues, men of letters, imperial ambassadors, as you know, of the Ottonian era. And they had, interestingly, across the empire, different ideas regarding what it meant to be a Roman, for example, or German, that we have seen dedicated videos. You can check those out. For example, Widukind of Corvey was not able to accept that with Otto II there is properly the concept of metaphysical Roman ethnicity of the imperial dynasty, but also for different reasons that now we can't simply digress on. Equally, Liutprand of Cremona, that was a Longbard, but in the sense he was basically a Romance, identified himself, in fact, as a German himself. And there is the beautiful story of a bit, of course, sort of redressed of his imperial embassy to Constantinople, where the staunch divide between, say, the Greeks and, in this case, even an Italian guy within the Holy Roman Empire of the Ottonian Saxons would manifest in a strenuous fashion. Now, Otto II remained in Germany under the regency of Archbishops Bruno and William during Otto I's 3.5-year absence in Italy. That, as you know, was where you got the imperial crown. Returning, in fact, as emperor in early 965, quite important year in history, a turning point. This is the sort of general idea of the refoundation of the Holy Roman Empire, even though the Sacrum Imperium and Sacrum Romanum Imperium had already existed since Charlemagne, and actually before, in an actual metaphysical and theological understanding of those same people. On February 2nd, 965, Otto I reaffirmed Otto II as heir during the 3rd anniversary of his own imperial coronation. Despite Otto I's imperial crowning in 962, Italy remained unstable, prompting a third expedition in 966, leaving Otto II, then 11, under regency again. To strengthen ties with the Byzantine Empire and resolve disputes over southern Italy in particular, Otto I sought a marriage alliance, requiring Otto II's coronation as co-emperor. In October 967, Otto II joined his father in Verona, the Adige River, marching to Rome. From there, where on, in fact, December the 25th, 967, Pope John XIII crowned him co-emperor, securing his succession. Marriage negotiations with Constantinople culminated in 972 under Emperor John I Tzimiskes, who offered his niece Theophano instead of the preferred Anna Porphyrogenita due to age constraints. You know what was actually happening here? It wasn't much about the latter, but John Tzimiskes was an usurper. The Macedonian dynasty was in charge. Anna Porphyrogenita would have been a proper, in fact, princess born in the purple. But this obscure niece of the usurper is given to the Ottomans because the Byzantines had a veritable idiosyncrasies, as you know, against, in particular, the Latins, the Germans. They preferred to give their daughters to the Slavo North, the Kievan Rus, than to the West, because they did not want to recognize the Romanity of the Western Empire, which was also ridiculous in a way because theologically and metaphysically the empire is Roman. So even though the Byzantines had recognized the Westerners as emperors since Charlemagne and the Roman crowning, they had basically said, no, we are actually the only Romans because legalism, statal continuity. There was a freaking Roman Empire in the West, right? And this is something that is almost mimified in Anantia. There wasn't actually ever a Roman Empire again in the West. It was just a bad imitation of it. No, that was the actual Roman Empire, and there is a very specific reason why that is the case. I mean, a Roman, say an archaic Roman of the 4th century BC would have immediately identified in that situation, of course, and also in earlier times, the continuity of Romanity in the Western Empire. Of course, that's a bit of an extreme idea. Of course, the 4th century BC Roman would have had a syncope thinking that the Germans would have wielded the Roman Empire, but it was exactly the Romans conferring it, and in general, but the sense of imperium, metaphysically, was fully understood. In this sense, much better by the Germans than by the Byzantines, that may have lied a little bit about it, but we don't have to underestimate in their literal sort of modernization, secularization, distancing properly from the idea of what actually constituted the Roman Empire. Why was it called like that? Rome, by the way, was not in the Byzantine Empire, nor the papacy, nor the relics of St. Peter and Paul, the holy herbs. We made enough videos about this. Now, on April the 14th, 972, the 16-year-old Otto II married the 14-year-old Theophano, who was crowned empress as a consequence, easing tensions with Constantinople over southern Italy. What was the deal with southern Italy? Well, we shall make lots of videos to actually show that properly. We talked about a bit of this in the videos about Langobardia Minor. We talked about this partially also in the videos about the Byzantine army organization, especially the urban relevance that the southern Italian towns, proper cities, had concerning their military autonomy and organization. The main issue was that this area was frontier for both empires, and therefore the local players, in particular the southern Longobards, could act as proxies for both, aggrandizing themselves in a land that did not know, say, a political unity since the time of the Ostrogoths, basically, and that it won't know that for other couple of hundred years, under the full establishment of the Siculo-Norman kingdom of Sicily. This fragmentation was a bit the prelude to that, as a matter of fact, as a power vacuum, but the Byzantines had historically tried, and especially succeeded at different times, to reconquer an importantly large amount of southern Italian territories, including the ones that had been coastally controlled by the Saracens from the Emirate of Sicily. And so there is an incredibly complex interplay that is better explained in a dedicated video. Naturally, a marriage between the Western and the Eastern heirs at this point, or something as we've seen about, because Otto II was the heir. Theophano was not really the big, Byzantine, in fact, Porphyrogenita princess, was something shadier, also not dynastically tied to the actual dynasty in charge. Never mind. In fact, this was a bit of a general hypocrisy, because the two empires kept hating each other, but in the moment it was a way of saying, well, let's join forces and see what happens. Because all these empires, of course, had some problem at their outskirts at any moment, also within themselves, so they needed temporarily to keep things quiet in southern Italy, and therefore not harassing really each other. This is important also because the Byzantines can't quite fully match the Ottonian power to a degree. As we will see, actually, the greatest enemies of the Germans at that point would turn out to be the Saracens. And if you know, say, the dreaded episode of Cotrone, as we will see now, well, you understand fundamentally why, right? But there was this old concept that, after all, the Italian peninsula had been largely politically unified by the Longobards before the Franks arrived, and so basically the Ottonians in their Renovatio Imperii were just mentally claiming what was their own, including, in a metaphysical sense, the Patrimonium Sancti Petri, or better, they claimed those lands and communities for a lay imperial rule that is never also fully lay; it's always sacred to an extent. The wide majority of the southern Italian mainland was understood at that point to be part of a broader Italic kingdom. I think never really fully materialized because, as we've seen also in the videos about medieval Lazio or the Duchy of Spoleto, and the Holy Roman Empire will arrive just so south, right, to, again, basically central Italy, encompassing parts of them. In the midst was the Papal State, but the Duchy of Spoleto is a good case of essentially a southern Longobard duchy in central Italy on the Adriatic watershed, that was in fact across the Papal land, as they will come to consolidate further as a proper state, because at this point actually the Ottonians have the highest sway ever held over Rome, over the papacy. But that's something also for another video. A lavish charter granted Theophanu extensive lands, including Istria, Pescara, that is in the major town in the Abruzzi, also recently started a regional series chapter about the medieval Abruzzi, and as well as properly estates in Saxony and the Rhineland. This was the appanage of a Byzantine princess in the Holy Roman Empire. It's nice because Istria was a contended territory between the Italo-Germans, the Byzantino-Slavs, and Pescara was this ideal port towards the east on the Adriatic, so not to make Theophanu feel that she couldn't go back home, she had bridges cut, but also importantly Saxony, the Rhineland. So we're talking the prestige of the Saxon Empire, the grandeur of Franconia, the more, at least in the Rhineland properly, the more advanced, among the more advanced and Romanized, by the way, regions in Germany. However, Otto II remained overshadowed by his father throughout all these events, denied administrative roles or territorial responsibilities, unlike, for example, his half-brother Ludolf, who had been made Duke of Swabia and would also rebel to his father, famously enough, as we have seen in our videos about medieval Swabia. Otto's seals were also, what would become Otto II's seals were smaller, and his few charters had limited scope, reflecting his subordinate status regardless of his nominal parity to his father. The imperial family returned to Saxony in August 972 after 5 years in Italy. On May 7, 973, Otto I died. And Otto II, aged 18 at that point, succeeded as sole emperor without opposition, having been king for 12 years and co-emperor for 5. On May 8 of the same year, the nobles, as recorded by Widukind of Corvey, confirmed his succession, and Otto II promptly upheld the rights of the Archbishop of Magdeburg. His early reign faced unresolved issues from his father's time. Otto I's legacy was enormous, right? He is one of the great heroes in imperial Germanic history. I recently made a video about the myth of the slumbering monarchs in the sacred mountains of medieval German folklore, and you see that basically Otto I is the same basically of Charlemagne and later Frederick I and the second son, right? And there is something crushing about this legacy that you have to consider also between, say, a father and a son. This issues included Saxon resistance to the Magdeburg diocese, which was seen as some sort of Waffenkönig kind of policy, as a matter of fact. In a land like Saxony, it was more crudely primitive and still somehow, yes, Christianized, but retaining a great deal of pride regarding sort of exception in the diachronic perspective. Also, the unclarity of Italian affairs, because the peninsula was incredibly complicated to rule, highly fractal, and in any case, at some point, a place where the Ottonians hadn't tried to rule from yet. As you know, Otto III, Otto's son, will actually try that. He will literally live on the Palatine Hill in an imperial palace, what remained of it, arranged by 10th century imperial Ottonian standards. But in any case, at this point, you had to come back north of the Alps. And so from Germany, controlling the peninsula, so rich and politically fragmented, was very complicated. But it was in any case the main objective of, in fact, imperial policy, chiefly also because the papal connection was there, and again, without the other universal authority system could not work. Otto's marriage to Theophanu alienated some Saxon noblemen as well, and his advisors, like Williges of Mainz and Hildebald of Worms, lacked strong noble ties, complicating governance. Right? The Saxons did not like this idea that the empire would Romanize too much. From a Northern European perspective, was still this heavy bias against the idea that basically the Germans had come to rule as a master race over the Romance peoples of Southern Europe, and that was something sort of polluting about this wealth and sort of exposure to also the broader Mediterranean sort of ideal promiscuity of, I don't know, there are the Muslims out there are the Byzantines that are actually possibly even worse in an Ottonian perspective. And in general, the Saxon lifestyle was so sort of original, right? So primal, that the very idea of the Roman civilization felt somehow alien to their culture. Secondly, the necessity of the Ottonian house to rule the empire with a minimal attempt at centralization had brought to the appointment, as we've seen, in very high and prestigious offices that in Germany were truly understood as a personal private business. No nobleman here, a veritable affront to the Eastern Frankish establishment as a whole. The Ottonians were so much into Italy because they could simply appoint as counts, so as the lay nobility, the bishops that already ruled the massive and fortified, in fact, Italian civitates. This will be actually a very important precondition for the development of the later communes, trying to stamp the Italic vassalatic establishment. It was also pretty, at this point, still aggressive and somehow untamed to a degree. This will be evident up until the beginning of the 11th century. We'll make videos about the last properly Italic kings and emperors. There were even at some point. In any case, Otto II's initial acts included visiting key Saxon, Frankish, that is Franconian and Lower Lotharingian centers, and holding diets at Worms and Aachen, the latter, as you know, the city of Charlemagne, the Rome of the North, built in stone, a very rare thing at the time, considered an encastellation in stone had started exactly in these generations, even before the arrival of the Ottonians in areas like the one around Rome, right? And it will arrive in northeast Germany and the Baltic only in the 12th century, just to give you a dimension probably of the difference of civilizational developmental scale, domestic challenges soon emerged as well. To maintain peace with his uncle Henry I's descendants, Otto II granted his cousin, Duke Henry II of Bavaria, the imperial castles of Bamberg and Steigaurach on June the 27th, 973. This Henry II, known as the Quarrelsome, was the father of the future Holy Roman Emperor Henry II that succeeded his second cousin Otto III. These were Ottonians, right? They were Saxons themselves, but they ruled in the quite important Eastern Mark that was a quite turbulent place that had actually contributed much more than, in fact, the same Ottonian propaganda, especially under Otto I, would grant, as opposed to the Saxon branch, to the destruction of the Magyars, right? That had suffered important defeats before and between Riade and especially Lechfeld, the latter especially being celebrated in Ottonian historiography as the biggest deal, but already I made a video about the Battle of Riade, as a matter of fact, and in any case the Bavarians had, because that was between Thuringia and Saxony, that tells you how far the Magyars could arrive in pre-Ottonian Germany, and that was the precondition, in fact, of compaction under the Ludolfings, that are the Ottonians. But the Bavarians, at the end of the day, were the guys properly constantly on the frontier with the Magyars, and so there is all a chivalric and very archetypal clash here between the Germanic warriors of the forest and this at this point Ugrian horsemen from the steppes, right, of the Pannonian plain. Henry II sought to expand his influence into Swabia after Bishop Ulrich of Augsburg's death on July the 4th, 973. So basically this guy gets, the week before, those important possessions from his cousin that aimed at essentially securing this eastern militarized frontier that doesn't even have a clear border, because Germany does not have an eastern border. It's just purely opinable where things start or begin, especially in an imperial direction. But that was, again, a hot frontier, required some... Historically, Bavaria had basically controlled most of the issues happening along with the Western Slavs. I mean, also Saxony was on the frontier out there together with Thuringia. But the major way of expansion was toward the Danube, right? And this would remain very important way. So in order to descend, as we've seen, through the Brenner Pass most, and to Italy, like we've seen there before, Verona, Rome, etc., you needed the eastern flank to be secure. The problem is, however, that this Bavarian branch of the Saxon house is very proactive. Without consulting Otto, Henry appointed his cousin Henry as bishop, clashing with Duke Burkhard III of Swabia and Otto II's authority. To avoid further escalation, Otto II approved the appointment on September the 22nd, 973. After Burkhard's death on the 11th or the 12th of November, 973, Henry demanded a Swabian duchy, but Otto appointed his nephew Otto, son of Ludolf, reinforcing dynastic control and sidelining Henry. This tells you how sort of fragile also the general political balance in German domestic affairs really was. Germany, we say, yes, because a Teutonic national identity has somehow been born, especially in the intelligentsia of St. Gall, of Fulda, Reichenau, and so on, as monastic centers tied also to the imperial. But this is a massive sort of conglomeration of stamp duchies that at this point are sort of augmented in power by their own very elite establishment that controls, as we've seen, everything as if it was literally their own personal possession. And this idea of appointing a bishop was just probably putting like a foothold at this point on the possession of that land to begin with, and the same ecclesiastical, in this sense, the higher spiritual power. This affirmation, this assertion will also sort of ideologically sediment that resentment within the church that was much more sort of civilly and culturally advanced to literally claim a veritable universal capacity, as it will be demonstrated during the Gregorian reforms, especially generations before by Sylvester II, Schwerpunkt of Aurillac, that exemplifies this sort of Roman Catholic takeoff in a moment in which instead the Ottonian Empire was under Otto III, properly expelled from Rome, was essentially disintegrating, and power was passing to the Bavarian branch. Also, just the fact that Henry could ask for the Duchy of Swabia, so basically controlling from Bavaria the entire Alpine arc for his cousin to pass through his land to the Italian expeditions. Yeah, that tells you how wild this whole thing is. Now, this, to say the least, sparked a rift, as Henry, with Bishop Abraham of Freising, conspired with the Poles of Dukes of Meshko I, and with the Czechs of Boleslaus II of Bohemia against the same Otto II, were in 974, aiming to restore his honor and influence. Bishop Pop of Würzburg demanded their submission, because of course these Western Slavs had no business, at least ideally, as far as what the Eastern Franks did, threatening excommunication as well, a tactic normalized by Otto I church control that, again, at this point was at its peak. So at that point, Henry sort of freaked out a little bit and complied, but Otto II imprisoned him at Ingelheim and Abraham at Corbeil. So this was a veritable uprising that was sort of cleverly halted. Here we could also enter the strategic military details of it all, but it's better, if anything, as a standalone video for each. But it's important to understand first and foremost the political background to this action that, if anything, did not escalate in a major fashion, thanks also to Otto's farsightedness. By 976, Henry either released or escaped, openly rebelled once again, claiming the imperial throne and rallying Saxon nobles this time, like Margrave Gunther of Merseburg and Count Egbert the One-Eyed. Otto II marched to Bavaria, besieged Henry's stronghold at Regensburg, and excommunicated him. This is quite fascinating. Merseburg was one of the most important cities in Ottonian Saxony, so the fact that Henry had such powerful Saxon friends against Otto was very disturbing for the Ludolfing house. Regensburg was historically the first quote-unquote capital of the Eastern Frankish kingdom on the Danube, in Bavaria, in a very, very frontier area in between the heart of. From one side you have Bavaria, from the other Swabia, from the other Franconia, Thuringia. It's also projected towards the Western Slavic, was a very relevant center. And in the process, Henry was excommunicated as well. This excommunication was not merely the ecclesiastical channel. It had a lot to do with the idea that divine power was properly owned by the emperor, especially in the Eastern Frankish mentality of the story. Henry, at that point, fled to Bohemia, right, showing how actually involved the Czechs already were in Eastern Frankish domestic affairs, prompting Otto II's extensive reorganization in July 976. He reduced Bavaria's territory by a third, first of all. Bavaria was enormous, right? It was something insane. Like, it arrived up to the Adriatic. It encompassed also nominally the entire northeastern Italy. It was something enormous and far, in fact, beyond the proper ethnic duchy of Bavaria. As we've seen in a dedicated video, that's where the Duchy of Carinthia is created, under Otto II, after this rebellion, from the excised land and stripping Bavaria of the mark of Verona as well, that, as we reiterated already, was the most important, with the Etsch Valley, the Adige Valley, the Brenner Pass, probably where the Via Imperii cross from literally the Baltic the old Amber Road, imagine that, to northern Italy, where in fact Henry from Bavaria had some support from the local Italic nobility as well, that hoped, in fact, Otto not to come too often, considering that they were also rising in power and they cared about their own autonomies. Otto appointed his nephew Otto of Swabia as Bavaria's duke, and Henry III, son of the former Bavarian Duke Berthold, as Carinthia's duke, favoring non-traditional allies. In August 977, Otto II invaded Bohemia to capture Henry, but a Bavarian revolt led by the Bishop Henry of Augsburg and the new Carinthian duke forced his return. You understand how complicated the story is. You can try to parcel out different parts of this enormous stem duchy to dilute your rival's power, which surely had occurred, as also Henry's fleet to Bohemia showed. But it's not like these parts would eventually renounce their own prerogatives and autonomy. Aided by the dukes of Swabia and Bavaria, Otto II besieged Passau, forcing the rebels' submission. At the Quedlinburg Diet on March 31st, 978, Boleslaus swore loyalty. Mieszko recognized Otto II's authority, and Henry was imprisoned under Bishop Volkmar of Utrecht until Otto II's death in 983. Otto II sent Henry's son to Hildesheim for ecclesiastical training, aiming to end the Bavarian Ottonians' secular power, to no avail, because in any case these were still Ottonian Ludolfing blood, and they were destined to rule, again, not just on Bavaria, but as Holy Roman Emperors. It's interesting, however, in fact, that he would keep him close, under control, and with some level of also cultural, ideological manipulation. Simultaneously, Otto II faced a rebellion from Danish King Harald Bluetooth, who, after Otto I's death in 973, sought independence from imperial control. Harald, King of Denmark since 958 and Norway since 970, allied with Norwegian forces under Earl Hakon and invaded the Duchy of Saxony in summer 974. Otto II's initial expedition to Denmark failed, suffering a defeat at Viglesdar near the Dannevirke fortification, this massive infrastructure that had been existing from actually quite a long time. Not merely the Carolingian era, we know that there was enough from the previous centuries as well. It was a layer of fortifications that obviously alone would have not stopped anything. You needed a field army in order to do so. It's just like the concept of the Wolfing about Offa's-Dyke, the St. Adrian's Wall, and so on. And it's relevant, of course, that this Norse power in the Jutland is coalescing and sort of, at this point, passing properly also from some more pre-Christian heathen power to some kind of more, in fact, Frankish Ottonian influence, evangelized kingdom. Much of this also being accelerated by the threat that the Saxons posed to the Danes. And so if you converted to Christianity and if you sort of stabilize your relations, you built up your own power along the same line, you had civilization much greater chances of survival, which is in fact what Denmark successfully scored. As Norwegian forces withdrew, by the way, Otto II launched a second campaign in autumn 974, breaching the Dannevirke and capturing parts of Jutland. Right? Imagine Denmark in the 10th century and this German army crossing in. That's something that will actually repeat itself historically, but the landscapes, the mentality, the time, it's something unspeakably beautiful. This naturally weakened Harald's position a big deal. Harald, in fact, ended up submitting to Ottonian authority. However, Earl Hakon, forced to convert to Christianity, rebelled in 975, establishing Norway's independence on that occasion. I made, if you're interested, a video for the entire, say, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden in medieval history on their own. And we will keep making videos of this kind. We really have to catch up a little bit with Scandinavian history, but we have made an important amount so far. Now, in the West, Otto II dealt with unrest from the Reginald brothers, Reginald IV and Lambert, who sought to reclaim their father's confiscated lands in Lorraine. Lorraine was the westernmost frontier of the Eastern Frankish kingdom, if anything. It had historically deep ties with also the Western Francia. This was an area that, as you know, had emerged as a non-state between the two major ones, and it had developed its own autonomy, identity, which was here being exploited further. I made some videos, by the way, in detail regarding Otto II's campaigns in this circumstance. You will see them in the usual top fixed link down below. But there is something I made from Ottonian warfare also in the West, in Lotharingia, etc. Also made some videos about Otto I and Otto II's Italic reigns, if you're interested in those expeditions as well. In 973, Otto II initially upheld his father's banishment of Reginald III, but faced their armed attempts to retake their inheritance. By 976, with support from King Lothar of West Francia, the brothers tried again. Otto II appointed his cousin Charles as Duke of Lower Lorraine on the North Sea and Egbert as Imperial Chancellor to stabilize the region, granting the brothers their lands in May 977. However, Charles's appointment provoked Lothar, who claimed Lorraine and was embroiled in a feud with Charles over an infidelity accusation. In August 978, Lothar launched a surprise invasion of Lorraine, targeting Aachen, and so the very symbol of imperial power north of the Alps, to capture Otto II and Theophanu themselves. This is as bold as it gets. It tells you again how powerful the Stand Duchies were and how sort of fluid and unstable the Eastern Frankish domestic situation was. In a sense, it's a bit like, Richard Lionheart, the most loved king in England, because he was basically almost never in England. Here, as we were pointing out before, it's a bit the same thing. Like, if you wage war against the Byzantines in Italy, the Slavs in the East, and so on, you're not burdening too much the German lands, right? You can't. There is a situation of sort of power sharing in a mob-like fashion. The Stem Duchies mostly looking at their own business and trying themselves to rise to royal imperial grandeur on their own. And so everything can actually turn pretty quickly. And yet, at this point, the Liudolfing's power was consistent enough that Otto II initially was skeptical of the reports of the Lorrainese rebellion. He fled later to Cologne as Lothar occupies Aachen's palace. Imagine the scene, by the way, and Lothar entering as Western Frankish ruler, by the way. And so probably the area where Carolingian power had really stemmed from Neustria. Let's be honest about that. I mean, the Carolingians, the Pipinids, Arnulfings were Austrasian, and so they came from Cologne. There would have been some sort of literal Franks, right? But at this point was, as we were also pointing out yesterday, there was still this relative fluidity between West and East Francia, right? There was still an idea that in theory, even the two things could have been reunited. Lothar looted Aachen's palace and symbolically turned a bronze eagle on its roof, right? So because it was not a golden eagle for that matter, and it was a way to essentially insult not the Imperium but Otto II's fitness to it. Provisions ran low, however, forcing Lothar's retreat after 3 days. Logistics is a bitch, really, but the main political goal was accomplished. Lothar failed to take Metz strategically. That would have sort of created a considerable buffer area at a provincial level against the Eastern Franks. But Metz was courageously defended by the Bishop Theodoric. We've seen it also in some video. And we observed how also, in fact, the importance of cities and the episcopal defense of the same was at this point in history. We're just after basically the major clashes with the second invaders that had habituated the bishops in particular to, because they lived in the cities mostly, compared to sort of lay vassals that were mostly living in this fortified estates in the countryside, but not only for that matter. I mean, the biggest cities were, of course, ruled by the most important bishops, that, as we've seen, was also part of a broader sort of Frankish practice at this point, and one of the old post-Carolingian Europe, creating a big deal of sort of administrative potential, military capacity. Mostly bishops had to train the local levies to properly guard, upkeep the walls. There was all a post-Roman infrastructural wealth to preserve in this regard, and besieging a city was something incredibly costly at this point, because it was still obviously universal part of warfare at the time. Otto II, vowing revenge, because an emperor could not really let this pass without retribution, convened a diet at Dortmund in July 978, declaring war on West Francia. In September, he invaded with Charles, devastating Reims, Soissons, and Laon in the northeast of, in fact, the Western Frankish kingdom, essentially of Neustria. These centers, I recently made a video about the city of Reims. We also talked about, just yesterday, about Soissons, Laon. We made some videos also about the former. These were some of the most important cities supporting the Western Frankish monarchy. On this occasion, Otto also crowned Charles as Western Frankish king, right, to challenge Lothar. Otto II arrived to besiege the same Paris, encamping at Montmartre. That, again, it's weird how sort of close certain topics are to our topic. We talk about Montmartre in the video about Saint-Denis, because we observed there that Montjoie is the Mount of Jupiter, eventually transformed in Christian times the Mount of Joy. And Montmartre is, in fact, the Mount of the Martyr, but it was actually the Mons Martis, the Mount of Mars. So such seminally sort of enormous symbols of, at this point, especially Western France, but had been part also of Carolingian spirituality. We don't know too much about those traditions before also a certain era, like the 12th century, largely, but you have there, unsurprisingly, Otto II having priests chanting the Alleluia, but winter sickness and Hugh Capet's relief army forced his retreat in November. And that was also underscoring the rise of a new soul, right? A new sacred ruler, the founder of the Capetian house, that much will actually succeed in the stead of the same Holy Roman Empire, the same German rule at some point. During the withdrawal, Western Frankish forces attacked Otto II's baggage train at the Aisne River during the crossing, which is one of the most delicate moments ever. And of course, these were the baggage train, the supplies mostly the least to pass, because it was sort of better just to cross with properly manpower than having, better alive in the moment without food than literally dying immediately. This also caused significant losses among the imperial ranks. In 979, Lothar faced domestic issues in Flanders as well, so we are in Lower Lorraine. And by 980, Otto II sought peace with West Francia that had contributed to all those agitations. It's not bad in terms of strategic projection from both sides. Otto up to Paris, Lothar up to Aachen. All right. This tells you again how still connected West and East Francia really were in practice, politically and strategically. At Margut, Lothair renounced his claims to Lorraine, which thus was de facto secured historically, regardless of the later Sun King's aims by the Eastern Frankish kingdom, recognizing Louis V as his heir on that occasion, while Otto II restored his honor by essentially showing that he had been able to respond to Lothair's incursion. The peace, however, was short-lived, as Lothair seized Verdun in 985, violating the treaty until his death the year later, and his sons in 987, ending the war, bringing, however, to the rise of Hugh Capet. With domestic affairs stabilized and his son Otto III born in June or July 980, Otto II shifted focus to Italy. Pope Benedict VI, appointed by Otto I, was imprisoned by the Crescenzi family and murdered in 974. If you're interested in these Roman warlords of the 10th, 11th century, I made a video probably on the Crescenzi house and the different, in fact, family heads that at some point, in fact, clashed with the same Ottonians quite sort of bravely and effectively, as a matter of fact. This tells you, by the way, how difficult it was to rule over Rome, not just because people think about the church, but Rome was constantly, of course, inhabited by incredibly powerful baronial factions that were all one with this imperial and papal strife. Otto II sent Count Sicco to secure the papal release, but Cardinal Franco Ferrucci, becoming anti-pope Boniface VII, orchestrated the killing. A revolt forced Boniface to flee to Constantinople, even, and Otto II installed Bishop Sicco's choice, Benedict VII, as pope. In 979, Benedict VII's position weakened, prompting Otto II, Teofano, and Otto III to travel to Italy without a large army, appointing Willigis of Mainz as regent in the Eastern Frankish kingdom. Arriving in Pavia on December the 5th, 980, considering all this, the Ottonians also have the Kingdom of Burgundy. All right, that's important. That's, in fact, when Otto, just random mention, because Otto II in Pavia reconciled with his mother, Adelaide, and received, that had been essentially the vessel, not just of the Italian kingdom, but part also of Burgundy, under the renovatio of Otto I, and received there the Agaron crown of Lombardy. Thus, Otto II was fully recognized as Italic king, the precondition for the full Holy Roman Imperial reconsecration. In Ravenna, Otto II hosted a scholarly debate between Gerberto of Aurillac, that, as we've seen before, like future Sylvester II had already spawned here, to a cursus honorum that involved, by the way, being Archbishop of Reims later on. And so you understand that always the same places, always the same political connections, intrigues, also within the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Something of incredible importance is happening in the church in these very years. Also, Ulrich, ending the debate to spare his chaplain, by the way. By February 981, Otto II restored Benedict VII in Rome, holding a grand Easter court attended by high secular and religious figures from Germany, Italy, and France, as a matter of fact, because the plenitude of the empire at that point was understood that what technically the Holy Roman Empire should have been, not merely, again, these lands in central southern Europe, but the entirety of Latin Christendom that was, by the way, at this point rapidly and overwhelmingly expanding. Otto II aimed to extend imperial control over all of Italy. In fact, influenced by Theophanes' hostility to the Byzantine Emperor Basil II's rise after John I Tzimiska's death in 976. This is soon explained, given that, as we pointed out before, Theophanes was basically a nobody compared to the actual imperial house, And Basil II, as you know, will also rise to be one of the greatest rulers by far in Byzantine history. Made multiple videos about him. We will revisit his exploit, etc. The death of Pandulf Ironhead, that was Otto I's key southern Lombard ally in March 981, destabilized the southern Italian mainland that the Ottonians at that point had sort of managed to control. Otto II partitioned Pandulf's lands, granting Capua and Benevento to Landulf IV, Salerno to Pandulf II, and later adjusting Benevento to Pandulf's nephew and installing Trasimund IV as Duke of Spoleto. Bit of cards changing. However, in order to balance a system that was basically ever more complicated, given that the old Duchy of Benevento had already fragmented again with Capua, Salerno, etc., in something way more sort of, in fact, complex. We've seen the Duchy of Spoleto being part of the Italic kingdom, so technically being imperial land, but here, in fact, one of the southern Longobards was given the duchy as well. And this because, in theory, in fact, though the Longobardia Minor was still considered as a sort of an extension of the same older Longobard kingdom, it's of the Italic one of current times. Despite failing to besiege Manso I in Salerno, Otto II gained recognition from all Longobard principalities. Salerno, as you know, has a very formidable rock. It's in a pretty insidious place. There are mountains over the sea, as also the Allies learned the hard way in World War II. And so campaigning there at the time was something pretty complicated, given that the southern Italian hinterland is basically all mountains. In Venice, Otto II redefined relations strained by Pietro IV's murder in 976. This had happened within sort of Venetian policy. Venice had been drastically rising in power and, more importantly, represented basically an imperial foothold, or at least politically so, in what was de facto the Byzantine Empire. Naturally, Venice belonged sort of historically, culturally, and more, we can argue nationally, to a broader sort of northern Italian background. Nevertheless, the Byzantines had maintained nominal control of the same. In practice, since Charlemagne, things had been, think about the Pact of 840, very sort of shaded here. Venice realized she could play in both. Really, nobody could besiege it, right? The son of Charlemagne, Pippin, what should have been the future emperor, died of malaria during the siege of Venice. It was something extremely hard was, and it's sort of very, very relevant that a power like the Franks at the time could think they could succeed. And naturally, it's not like islands cannot be taken, but Venice had been structuring itself not just in a traumatically aggressive, proactive and expansionistic fashion at sea, but in this sense managing to pile up such an enormous amount of wealth to drastically reinforce, especially her navy, right? They didn't even need, of course, walls per se. The fleet alone was rising to be one of, in fact, what will become the most important one in the Middle Ages. And here, it was a big deal for Otto to be physically in Venice. He supported the pro-Ottonian of, obviously, Coloprini family against the pro-Byzantine Morosini, imposing trade embargoes in 981 and 983, the latter severely impacting Venice's economy, for that matter. The Morosini, by the way, are some of the most important admiral families in the history of Venice. We also talked about them in the War of Candia, so we're talking literally 700 years later. This family was still around as the top-notch sort of naval command available. Otto II's death in 983 halted Venice's full integration into the empire, but in a sense, it would have been enough to politically greenlight that, to sanction it in some way, and things may have really changed a lot. Not just in the relations with the East, but also in northern Italy. Venice remained, however, something really on its own outside of the Holy Roman Empire, and at some point not even recognized as part of the Byzantine one. Otto II strengthened the church's role in the footsteps of his father, particularly monasteries, to stabilize the empire. He and Theophano founded Memleben Abbey, endowing it richly, possibly as an imperial mausoleum. Remember the story of the mountains where the sacred rulers slept. It was really understood as a sort of parallel of Saint Denis. Unlike Otto I's single monastic foundation, Otto II established, again, Memleben, Tegernsee, Bergen, and Arneburg, using monasteries for treason trials post-rebellion as well. This what had happened with the Henrys of Bavaria. Otto appointed monks like Eckehard I, Maiolus of Cluny, and the latter really, we will talk about him in a monastic video because he was one of the most sort of spiritually impacting figures, monasticism of that generation, and John Philagatus as advisors. The latter was a Greek presence, which brought, as we've seen, also a big deal of, together with Theophano, lots of Greek manuscripts, lots of further marvels had arrived from the East, with John serving as a chancellor, 980, 982, and abbot of Nonantola as well. That was one of, also made a reference to Nonantola in one of the videos about the hollow paths of, monastic, Catholic monasticism. Otto II joined prayer confraternities with St. Gallen and St. Bavo, enhancing his spiritual legacy. So you see south and north in the German kingdom, in Italy, etc. In 980, Otto II demanded a Pisan fleet that was also one of the most robust of the years. As you know, Pisa will later emerge as one of the most powerful maritime powers in the Mediterranean, already at the time, in fact, very active, to confront, indeed, Islamic raids from the Emirate of Sicily. And there is all a bit of a hidden, forgotten naval military history at this point, since Carolingian time from Bonifacius, that, as you know, was this count of Tuscany in Carolingian era that also gave the name of the strait between Corsica and Sardinia, that arrived to raid and plunder up to Tunisia. Right? As actually the Byzantine rulers of Sicily had done. We partially discussed this in the video about Byzantine Sicily. After Pandulf's Ironheads, as we see, Longobards rulers' death, the Emir Abu al-Qasim from Sicily intensified attacks in Apulia and Calabria. The Saracens had done something very similar to what the Vikings did. They established fortified rings, mostly in this coastal position. They didn't really colonize. They didn't have the manpower from North Africa, not even from Sicily, to further settle consistent demic colonies. There is all the sort of anti-Italian bias that people say, the Italians darkened because of the Saracens in the... There is actually not much of a great evidence of that. For anyone who has an idea of this population density, also per capita wealth in Mediterranean, knows that the northern shores of the Mediterranean are escalatingly superior, basically in everything. And when you look at Saracen history, you realize that basically these forces had been called mostly by the local rulers, like a bit like the Magyars in the Eastern Frankish kingdom, letting them pass, just not to plunder their land just next door, than having any real actual power on their own. They were actually pretty nasty and disturbing. The aforementioned Maiolus had been captured at some point. There is all it's very interesting. There's the base of Fraxinetum. Made a video on that in Provence, where, in fact, the same Germany, the Upper Rhineland, was devastated by the Saracens via land. Interestingly enough, and so this is a bit of an issue, and even worse than the Byzantine one for the Ottonians in particular. In January, first of all, in September 981, Otto II marched south to confront the Muslims, right, in southern Italy, reconciling with Manso I of Amalfi. This guy was the prince of the local Byzantine duchy. Amalfi will actually rise as the first maritime republic in the interest of time. I made a video about medieval Amalfi. There were other coastal centers, were even Salerno that we mentioned before on the sea, or Gaeta, etc. And Amalfi was always very loyal to the Christian cause. For that matter, also in Raffaello's rooms in the Vatican, there is this very beautiful, Contra hostes fidei semper pugnavit Amalfi, which is a reference to the fact that, also as far from a Roman perspective, this Byzantine, but de facto now Italian fleet had always been, just as Pisa, by the way, had been and would remain an impactfully Roman city, identitarily speaking, even well into the communal era. They had this great deal of naval capacity. Amalfi was particularly rich, virtually impregnable. Like the Normans will take generations before being able to finally capture it, because it's literally against the mountain. And so if you don't have an adequate fleet, like most of these feudal terrestrial powers had, you can't really take it so easily. There are some passes that are easily controlled from the hinterland. But Amalfi, in this sense, is instrumental to provide some support to Otto against the Saracens. And again, you can check out the autonomization of powers like Amalfi, Naples as well, from all these previous Byzantine duchies on the sea that, however, now were not really controlled by Constantinople anymore. In January 982, Otto targeted Byzantine Apulia as well. This was very important to show who was the best. Remember, the government at Constantinople had switched. Basil II was not much of a friend anymore, regardless of Theophanos' marriage with Otto. And Otto, in fact, besieges Taranto. In March, this formidable natural port with 3 internal seas, literally kilometers deep, something insane, naturally speaking. It was an old Spartan colony, as you know, it will remain. Also up to, I made a video about the British raid on Taranto, and, during the Cold War, NATO from Taranto literally controlled the entire Mediterranean. That gives you an idea of its strategic relevance. And on that occasion, Otto adopted the title Romanorum Imperator Augustus. So literally, the most unequivocal display of imperial Catholic traditional power ever, right? In the purest and fullest Roman fashion in front of the world, saying basically we managed to, we don't really know, because despite German chroniclers claim Taranto's capture is unconfirmed, likely reflecting political propaganda, but it would have not been the first time. The once buried Taranto had been an object of content between the Franks and the Byzantines. Louis II, the Carolingian emperor ruling from the Italic kingdom, these cities had been at some point captured by the Saracens, had become emirates. And at this point, marching in the south, like the Franks had already done before in recapturing one of these cities, was something enormous. At this point, it was, however, mostly an Ottonian act against the Byzantines. And so the story goes that Otto celebrated Easter in Taranto, which in any case was a massive display of power. Even just waging war so far south was a big deal. By the way, consider that the earth, as you know, widens. So Italy is long, latitudinally speaking. And so even waging war again up to there was a very important postural warning to the Byzantines. Otto II moved west, defeating an Islamic force in early July. Campaigning in the southern Italian sun is not really pleasant, especially in armor, in the fray. Informed of Abu al-Qasim's retreat near Rossano, Calabro, Otto II left Theophano, Otto III, and the imperial treasury there, pursuing the emir. This first move was actually wise, but as you know, and we're anticipating before, there is this massive, and I stress massive, imperial defeat. It was really something ruinous, terrible, and things could have gone so much better had, of course, the Germans won there, but except for the Saracens. On July the 15th, 982, at Cape Colonna near Crotone, it's also said as Crotone, Otto II's heavy cavalry killed Abu al-Qasim, but a hidden Islamic reserve of 5,000 cavalry surrounded his forces, inflicting around 4,000 casualties. We know that losses were that devastating because they included Landulf IV, Bishop Henry I of Augsburg, the Margrave Gunther of Merseburg, and the Abbot of Fulda. So here, like, the sources acknowledge the terrifying level of losses. It says that Germany wept because of this battle and because some of the finest men were taken out. And Otto II barely escaped with his life, and there is this almost sort of tragicomical instance in which he basically swam to a Byzantine ship, possibly paying a ransom for release, aided by a Mainz Jew, Kalonymos, who provided a horse. And he had, however, to escape basically from the same ship, ideally sort of going back to land swimming, when he realized that the Byzantines did not really want to help him, but to bring him as a hostage to Constantinople. So he threw himself overboard and he swam back to the Calabrian coast. And this defeat, again, was really the empire's worst. It weakened Ottonian control in southern Italy. It allowed even Byzantine Islamic alliances to reclaim Apulia. By the way, think about how sort of interested the Byzantines were to the broader Christian cause in that sense. Of course, like, you have to understand them, it was a way to go like another, but in general, right? The dynamic of the battle is interesting because the sources actually describe this. I will cover it. I know it's part of the cyclical choice of battles that I will document at some point. It shows how sort of probably also narrowly won by the Saracens this was, because the Ottonians likely leveraged on their frontal shock power capacity with their crushing charge and killed, in fact, the Emir Abu al-Qasim. However, the Saracens also leveraged on their mobility, agility, and they attacked in an ambush from the rear, from the flank. The Ottonian heavy cavalry at that point was difficultly sort of reliable. We don't know 100% what actually happened, but the broader dynamic does make sense, right? And it would be interesting to know more about the battlefield or whatever, but unfortunately for this day and age, we don't know much to begin with. Otto II retreated to Rome, given that the entire southern Italy had become unsafe. He also held a diet at Verona on Pentecost of 983. So he spent the winter in Italy. He appointed Conrad as Duke of Swabia and Henry III as Duke of Bavaria, sent his nephews Otto of Swabia to Germany for reinforcements, and this Otto died en route, as a matter of fact, which is not a great omen, and secured Otto III's election as King of Germany. The only such election south of the Alps. This is very interesting. Like, this was the case of an election held probably with the German nobility was left after the battle for the entire empire, which normally had been a German prerogative, would always take place there. The defeat of Crotone reached fast places like Wessex in southwestern Britain, underscoring its magnitude. Saxon losses were severe, and Duke Bernard I of Saxony turned back due to Danish Viking raids, because, by the way, and as you know, also with the Great Slavic Uprising in the East, the imperial blow suffered in southern Italy immediately reactivated, just by the shrinking in imperial deterrence, all the hottest frontiers, still with the embers burning underneath the ashes. Otto II at this point planned a naval blockade and economic warfare against the Muslims, but the Great Slav Rising in 983 disrupted these efforts, which should have been activated from Italy, that had, as we've seen, the means, manpower, the infrastructure, the logistics, the ships to do so. Sparked by the Lutizzi at Retra, the Great Slavic Revolt saw Havelberg and Brandenburg bishoprics destroyed. on June the 29th and July the 1st. These were, again, areas not, say, east of the Elbe that were, again, had been colonized by the Germans. And again, I made multiple videos about this. We'll, if anything, talk more in depth about the general circumstances that, as you know, were quite bloody and brutal. Amberg and St. Lawrence Monastery in Kalbe were attacked as well, interestingly enough. There was surely some Viking participation in this, but they were mostly the Obotrites under Mstivoid that carried this out. Thietmar of Merseburg attributed the uprising to German mistreatment, which is interesting sort of from a sort of Latin Germanic historiographical national perspective, so to say, because you could have said this is just a bunch of barbarians, of primitives that we call. But there is no doubt that the Germans didn't have a particularly pronounced sensitivity for such trivia like human life, especially if this life is Slavic one, that in their view can be barely seen as human, again, shockingly traumatic theaters about which we know so very few, but that doesn't mean that in relative terms they weren't even more brutal than the other theaters we have seen here. Particularly, it seems that the Markgrave Dietrich of Haldensleben was particularly unkind to the local subjects. A Saxon army led by Archbishop Gisela of Magdeburg and others repelled the Slavs, however. They didn't have really much of a chance. This was their moment to sort of buy time and resources, but not having much of a state of anything. The Eastern Frankish forces were superior. This Slavic forces were repelled at the Tanga River. However, Gisela of Magdeburg lost the northern and Billung marches, temporarily halting Christianization and Germanization east of the Elbe for 2 centuries, at least in a broader dramatic rhetorical sense, but not quite in practice. The Sorbs and Lusatians did not join the revolt, however, and you should have asked them why. In general, they were sort of a bit wiser than the Obotrites. Those were literally the most northwesternmost Slavic people. They were terrible. They were not really as developed already as these other groups. Otto II returned to Rome, by the way. We are in September 983 to appoint a new pope after Benedict VII's death, selecting Pietro Canepanova as John XIV. A malaria outbreak halted military plans and caused Otto II's own death on December 7th, 983, at age 28. He could have, again, been such a grand ruler. It seems like that he was gifted, even when you study these people's stories, regardless of the reputation that very often scholars give in a broader, like this was more of a negative or a positive, like people like to debate this without getting into the actual factuality here. Of course, we can know just so much whose fault was this. Like in general, of course, Otto was in charge of everything, so he was responsible for that anyway. But in practice, like managing the situation was not easy at all. And when you see this rulers dying so young, you also wonder. I mean, this was the son of Otto I. It was something, again, enormous in terms of prestige, of Romanity, of Germanity, of imperial grandeur. This. Otto died in his Roman palace, possibly for a mistreated illness. We're not even particularly informed how he died. His wealth was distributed to the church, the poor, Adelaide, Matilda, and loyal nobles. Buried in St. Peter's Basilica, the only emperor interred there, his tomb was later moved to the Vatican grottos in 1618. Otto III, aged 3, was crowned king in Aachen. We are on Christmas Day of 983. This is cute in the sense that, as we've seen, the child Otto II had been crowned himself with his father at that point. Here in this dramatic situation with the same emperor died and buried in Rome there with his son, rising to this titanic enterprise with Theophanu as a regent, by the way. Something deeply fascinating, even here booting the story of Otto III that we'll see better at another point, but just think about that. You're the son of Otto II, and your mother is a Byzantine princess. You have, as we were talking about yesterday also for Philip I of France, in the following century, son of Anne of Kiev, the daughter of Yaroslav the Great. Just imagine like the stimuli, this German and Roman, German and Italian background, this Greek and Germanic background. This is really an incredibly difficult legacy to bear, something that in fact would bear great fruits as well for Otto III, but that would also finally end in failure. Meanwhile, Henry II, released from captivity, briefly seized the same Otto III, claiming the regency, but relinquished him on June the 29th, 984, under pressure from loyal dukes and villages. The Germans in general did not like that action, because it seemed like, everybody knew how bold and, properly shameless to a degree Henry II had been in many ways. The quarrelsome is not a random nickname. He was naturally clever and capable himself, but he realized exactly for this reason that he could not maintain his nephew just as a prisoner. And there was all the rightful, not even as a protector of his, you could act like that. Theophano and Adelaide maintained stability. So credit to them in this delicate minority of their descent, ensuring Otto III's reign, in fact, despite the empire's crisis in Italy and the Slavic territories. Otto II's reign, marked by ambitious expansion and severe setbacks, thus preserved the Ottonian dynasty's rule across the Alps, and it set a premise for a further affirmation in there. And as I was saying in the beginning of the video, it's really important to look at this world, this reality, these places, and all the variety of imperial, imperial connection in all this. It's a phase in European history that we somehow neglect. Like when is that, do you think, reboot to a degree? With William the Conqueror, with the First Crusade, that surely was an important moment. But what was this, broadly speaking, like continental European world and reality? It's important to acknowledge, because it's just like something much more central at the end of the day. Germany wielding this great empire, the same France that, in spite of all the limitation of the monarchy, was actually, as a whole, the bigger and sort of, had it been unified, as it would happen later, the more powerful country. You have Italy with Rome, this Byzantine presence, and again, such a nascent level of power with the Italian Maritime Republic, also with the various cities, power ever more sort of relevant in organizing. Today we didn't talk much about that, but Otto's reign was also relatively limited for that matter. So the imperial balance, etc. So it's a very important phase, and I would recommend also watching because I really made a fair amount of videos about the Ottonian, not as many as I would have liked to. Nevertheless, something like, how much is that? This is the 23rd video. Well, it's not too much, but considering the wall of other videos as well, like there is, and I'm glad really we're expanding on this. Every day I say, well, I'm glad I chose this specific topic, because it's really something that you require in a broader sense, and in order to understand the wall. And again, understanding Ottonian history is incredibly relevant. I really recommend it in a broader sense. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, do a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.